Hello, this is an introduction to ethics that we'll be talking about during this course. Let's talk a little bit about what our agenda is. First, we'll be talking about what ethics is, and we'll be talking about where ethics come from, and we'll be talking about kind of common approaches to ethics. Most of these will break out into separate videos, so as not to bore you too much in one sitting. But it is a fairly deep topic, so take a moment, make sure you're comfortable, and let's jump in. So, ethics. What is it? It's a kind of a system of thinking about things. It's an approach, a perspective. Um, People talk a lot about ethics, but we really kind of misconstrue that term quite often as to what exactly ethics are. Ethics is really the foundation of how to make decisions as opposed to what those decisions should be. Um, and One of the things that are often confused is that ethics is not necessarily what the religious commandments are, what the law is, or what social conventions may be. Often you'll hear people say that something is unethical. Actually, it may be ethical from a certain approach, but it may be illegal, which is a whole different can of worms. So, um, another way to think about ethics is that it's kind of a map, a process or a framework for us to reach a decision. Um, it helps us kind of investigate the questions, um, but as to, for example, what is the best way? What is a good life? Um, what is right? What is wrong? All of those things that we'll wrestle with during the course of this program. Um, it boils down sometimes to what is in the best interest of society, what is a person's appropriate choice, and what is the ultimate good, which we'll talk about in some more detail. So where do we get ethics from? Ethics can come from a number of places. One is a religious source. Um, People quite often presume that religion is ethics, and often they may be synonymous, but there may be differences. But one source is certainly the religious foundation of whether that is Islam, whether it's Judaism or Hinduism, will often form a foundation for ethics. Some people would argue, of course, that the only source of moral rules is God. If you have the Ten Commandments, you pretty much have it nailed. Other folks take a different perspective, and this is certainly the much more common approach amongst the Greek philosophers, for example, and those who have followed them of ethics comes from the human consciousness, that if one thinks hard enough, reflects enough, that one can tell goodness from badness, that it is a natural sort of intuitive sort of process, that there are sort of natural laws. There's a social contract. There's a universal sort of source of right and wrong and the correct answer. Uh, some would argue that may or may not be true based upon their experience with humans, but certainly the classic philosophers would argue that with enough reflection and enough contemplation, that people can figure out what the proper response to any situation is from a moral or ethical background. So, taking the classic sort of approach, one looks to human consciousness and intuition. For the moral truths, well, maybe those moral truths aren't discovered um, by rational argument or by having a hunch or by having a feeling. Maybe that there is a certain sort of realization out there that the truth already existed, that all we had to do was to find it because it pre-existed. Maybe it's more of an economic sort of approach of there being a rational sort of moral cost-benefit analysis that can be undertaken. This is certainly a common argument by those who are not religious, and it is certainly part of the consequentialist ethics approach, and certainly utilitarianism, which is a part of consequentialism, falls within this category. And consequentialism, as you might guess, really looks at what are the consequences of a human action and doesn't really deal with or address or is necessarily concerned with the actions themselves. You might think of the ends justify the means. And to the consequentialist or the utilitarian, one would simply look at what would produce the best outcome for the greatest amount of good. There also may be a desire for the best for people in each unique situation. This is referred to as situational ethics. It rejects sort of prescriptive rules, the Ten Commandments sort of approach, and argues that individual ethics individual decisions ought to be based on the unique circumstances and facts at the time. That rather than follow rules, a decision maker should follow the desire to seek the best for those involved in the situation. That there's no sort of moral roadmap that one has to follow. More cynical folks would say that ethics is really sort of a political power. One could argue, for example, the classic religion, particularly Christianity coming through Catholicism, was really more of a power structure in its decision making. That ethics is used to codify a political ideology, whether that is a conservative approach to things, a liberal sorts of approach to things. Ethics reflects what the political power elite have to say. That in essence, the state's going to tell you what the ethics are going to be, and you're going to follow them. And that is often used to dominate the lower class or the subjects of the kingdom by invoking the ethical rules, maybe even invoking religion to control those folks. So how do you go about finding an ethical answer? Some would say that one would pray. The classic philosophers would believe that one thinks rigorously about the moral principles and problems and will find the ethical answer. Current philosophers would argue that ethics leads people not to conclusions but to decisions, i.e. how do they get there? The classic religious scholar would say that answers come from revelations or scriptures or church tradition. More current philosophers or the classic philosophers would argue that simply by reflecting, one would find those answers. In ethics, we have what we call the realist and the non-realist, and one has to think about this carefully because it is probably the opposite of what common sense would be. Ethical realists would argue that human beings can discover ethical truths that are already have an independent existence. Ethics are out there in the bushes somewhere. All we have to do is go and find them. These are the real ethical truths, that these moral qualities exist out in nature. Those who are non-realist would argue that humans invent ethical truths, and I'm afraid I may be in that camp. That I'm a bit skeptic that the ethical truths are out there waiting for me to be found. That all I have to do is look hard enough, and I'm not finding them. Apparently, I'm not looking hard enough in doing that. This is an alternative view that actually ethics tend to be not sort of standalone, independent entities, that in fact they are influenced by a lot of things, whether that's by your culture, by your religion, by your traditions, that an ethical decision in India may be quite different than an ethical decision in Russia. That one who grew up in the Hindu faith may reach a ethical decision with all due reflection, quite different than one growing up in the Christian faith. And likewise, growing up in a tradition of an African tribe may lead to an entirely different moral judgment than one who grew up in Alaska in an Eskimo tribe. So one should be quite open to the idea that ethics are fairly fluid, and there are rarely any sort of absolute right answers of yes or no. At best, we have tried to identify a number of ethical approaches that we'll talk about, and those ethical approaches kind of put a roadmap down of how one would do it in that approach of ethics, but rarely tell you exactly what the right answer is. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. As I mentioned, the problem with ethics is that ethics rarely give you the right answer. It's not usually something that you can verify, that you can say absolute 100% confidence that, guys, under this approach to ethics, this is the absolute right answer. There's always ambiguity, very little safety in being right, because another ethicist of the same school as you are may reach a different conclusion by taking into consideration other factors. As I alluded to earlier, ethics are often used as a weapon, in that one is considered unethical if they do X. Well, often that is intended to be an effort to control the behavior of either that person or the population in which he is existing, by saying that he is an outcast, an outlier, and transgressing whatever the morals are of that community in which he lives. So let's talk a little bit about ethical decision making. There's certainly the first school that we'll take up is what's referred to as the rights duties approach. This is also referred to as deontology, to give it a little more pizzazz. There is the utilitarian approach, which is quite often employed these days. It is the cost-benefit analysis, i.e., what is the outcome, what is the result of the behavior. There's what is referred to as the virtues approach, which is what is the virtuous thing to do, what is the honorable thing to do. This is certainly one of the classical Greek approaches. There is the fairness approach, i.e., what is the most fair to the stakeholders in the decision. There is the community good approach, which is what is the best for the community. There is the casuity approach, which is one word that is awfully difficult to pronounce, and if you went to an ethics program and they pronounced it differently, more power to you. In essence, this is an approach that takes looks at the facts at the time, applies all of the factors involved, and comes to a conclusion based upon that situation. Very much the situational approach to ethics, as opposed to one that has a sort of preset number of factors that one considers and a roadmap. And last but not least, that we'll talk about, and there are an endless number of ethical approaches that can be discussed. The Eastern cultures have many based on Confucius. You may find them based upon Buddha. You may find them based upon the Hindu approaches or Islam. But one of the most popular approaches that we see in medical ethics and bioethics these days is the four principles approach. And that is the approach that has been championed, much related to human research. And we will talk in detail about that, because that is probably what you will encounter most in practice these days, and we'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses of that. So with that, we are at the merciful end of this presentation. We will, in the next series of PowerPoints, talk about each of the individual types of ethical approaches that I've listed before, and work through kind of examples of those and how one would employ those in practice. Thanks for joining me.